thank Chris for giving me the opportunity to speak to you guys tonight. I'm hoping that this lesson will give us all just a better understanding of how much love God has for us as His children. And my message tonight is entitled, "Come to me and you will find rest for your soul." And it's based off the passage which is in Matthew 11:28 through 30. It's probably a very familiar passage, especially if you grew up in church like me. But I'm going to read it again just so we have a refresher on it. Matthew 11:28 through 30 in the ESV goes like this. "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And as I said, this passage is a very familiar passage. I remember hearing it many times when I was growing up, and I'm sure I learned it at some point in Awana. It's a very straightforward passage too. It's so straightforward that of all the translations that I looked at, they pretty much all translate this the same exact way. So they all say pretty much what I just read. It's really easy to understand. But not only that, but it's an extremely encouraging passage, an uplifting passage. Who doesn't want rest? Who couldn't use a little rest every once in a while? We all live very busy lives. We go here, we go there, we do a million things, and we all need a little bit of rest once in a while, right? For that reason, this has become a very popular passage within the church. I mean, you can go down to the Christian bookstore, I'm sure, and you can find this verse on, Bible covers, mugs, pens, Christian iPhone covers. And I'm sure, it's a very popular passage because it promises an amazing thing, rest. And we live in such a restless age with Twitter, Facebook, CNN, Fox News, iPads. The news never ends. How many people found out about the Chardon shooting in any other way other than the newspaper? I mean, pretty much everybody knew about it within minutes. So, you see, and it can be a good thing because how many people, when you heard about it, were immediately able to pray for the people in Chardon or the victims or things like that? So you were able, because of the instant news, you were able to pray for these people, and God was able to work in the situation. But with all this news going on all the time, it can be just very restless. And so you just wonder, don't we just need some rest? Isn't that what Jesus is offering here? Rest. But I think there's a much deeper meaning to this verse than we normally give to it. See, when I read this passage as a kid, what I heard was, if you're weary from working a lot, then I'll give you a time of rest. As if Jesus was giving a divinely sanctioned nap time. And my thought was, well, I don't really need that. Playing PlayStation 2 doesn't really, it doesn't really make me that weary. All I want is someone to make me a sandwich. Amen. Interpretation was a little off. But see, there's a much deeper meaning and a much more fulfilling meaning to the verses before us, and I hope we can dig that out tonight and find the rest that Jesus is talking about. With that being said, let's look at verse 28. Verse 28, Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Jesus gives a clear invitation to those who are listening. In the context, Jesus had just pronounced woes upon the city, curses upon the cities that he had been preaching to and where he had done most of his miracles, because they hadn't listened to his message, they hadn't turned from their sins, they hadn't put their trust in him as Messiah. So he had also, in the verses right above these, thanked God for the blinding of their eyes, the blinding of the eyes of the hard-hearted people who wouldn't listen, and that he had opened the eyes of those who were, quote, little children, those who came to Jesus with childlike dependence. They put their trust in him, like a kid puts their trust in their parents for everything. So he then clarifies that those who will know, as in a personal relationship, him and his Father in heaven and himself are those to whom he reveals himself. He thanks God for that. So these are the same people that he thanked God for in the prayer. And these are the same people he's preaching to. So those same people, he's saying, come to me. But let's look and see if we can be counted in that group. Let's see if we can apply this to ourselves. Jesus says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden. Jesus is calling those who labor and are heavy laden. Now, the term labor here doesn't just mean to work. It isn't just, doing homework. This is working to the point of exhaustion. It's a time of work. It's the type of work that makes you sweat, the type that makes you sore the next day. And I've already said that Jesus isn't primarily talking about physical rest here. So what kind of labor is he talking about? I think we can get a better understanding by seeing what heavy laden means. Heavy laden was used metaphorically to describe the piling on of burdensome laws or rituals. Picture loading your book with every single one of your textbooks, your book bag, and then on top of that, somebody else hands you their textbooks to put in your book bag, and then on top of that, your other friend gives you his textbooks to put in your book bag, and on top of that, somebody else's, and then so on and so on. I mean, the burden of carrying the book bag would probably become really hard. It would be really hard not to collapse just carrying it down the hallway, let alone carrying it for the rest of junior high and high school. So after a while, you'd want to collapse. And this is what was happening to many of the people in Jesus' day. They had the commands of God in the Old Testament, which they were supposed to obey. And this alone is hard enough. I mean, who here has kept the Ten Commandments? All of them. But then on top of that, the Pharisees had developed a system of fences by which they wouldn't even come close to breaking the commands, or so they thought. This meant that on top of the commands of God, they had the commands of the Pharisees, which were easily over 600 total. So all these laws which they were supposed to keep were supposed to earn them a right standing before God. They were supposed to be righteous because of these 600 laws that they kept. Can you imagine the burden, though, if you failed to meet one of these commands, how burdening it would be, because you are now not right with God. So the burden on a lot of these people was getting to be very heavy because they kept felt they had to keep all of these 600 commands. And so Jesus comes to these people who are trying to earn their way into God's favor and feeling the tremendous burden of their guilt. And he says, come to me and I will give you rest. But notice the invitation is for those who are laboring and who are heavy and feeling burdened. The Pharisees were laboring, but they didn't feel the heavy burden. They didn't feel the burden of their sin. They didn't feel the burden of their failures. These are the people today. There's people today who aren't doing that, who labor and they work and they try to earn they try to earn God's righteousness, but they don't feel that they're failing. So every religion besides biblical Christianity says that if you only do enough good and don't do enough evil, however they want to define that, you can earn God's favor for yourself. But with Jesus, he comes and says, no, you can't do it on your own. All of your laboring and all of your striving will not give you anything except a bigger burden and a bigger debt before God. But if you come to me, I will give you rest. I will give you rest from your burden. He says essentially, you can't free yourself from your burden by doing good, but I can through my death. Come to me and forsake your efforts to make yourself right before God. Lay your burden on my shoulders. I can carry it. It's amazing because Jesus doesn't even specify what kind of burden. There's all sorts of sins that burden us down, and Jesus says simply, come to me, and I will give you rest. If you're burdened by gossip, he says, come and find rest. If you're burdened by anger, he says, come and find rest. And if you're burdened by lust or pornography, he says, come and find rest. And if you're burdened by trying to please everybody, come and find rest. And no matter what you're burdened by, he says, come and rest. Find rest in me because I have borne your burden on my shoulders on the cross. We can bring him all of our burdens, every single one, and confess all of our failings before him. And as 1 John 1:9 says, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. He promises rest to those who come to him. And the rest can be defined as either permitting one to cease from labor in order to recoup their strength, or simply to refresh somebody. And in this time of unrest, particularly with everything that happened in Chardon, Jesus offers us eternal rest. That's what the kids at Chardon need. That's what even TJ needs to hear. In this terrible time of grieving and mourning, Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you rest. And not just rest for now, but eternal rest, eternal strength and refreshing. You can rest in knowing that God doesn't let a single sparrow, or let alone a human, to perish without his knowledge. And you can rest in knowing that things like this, tragedies like this, are used by God for the good of his people, for the good of those who love him. In the midst of these difficult times, we can find rest, eternal hope, eternal confidence in God. This is the rest that Jesus gives to those who come to him. His people come to him and they find a refreshing of their strength to do work for God. Not to earn his pleasure, but because he's already given, they've been given his pleasure by what Jesus did on the cross. And so they want to serve him out of love and gratitude. This thought flows into verse 29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. The yoke was a tool that they used on animals to join them together in order to get work done, in order to keep them working together. But the yoke was also used to speak of submission to another, to somebody else. So you were under the yoke of somebody if you submitted yourself to what they said to you, what they taught you. And A.T. Robinson said he knows that this was also used as religious teaching. So if you were under a rabbi's teaching, you were under their yoke. And so you were submitting yourself to what the teacher was telling you. And I mean, we do this today in school. You are under the yoke of your math teacher or your history teacher or your science teacher. You say, yes, I do believe that what you're teaching me is true. 2 plus 2 is 4. And the earth is round. And there is a correct way to use there, and there. You submit yourself to their teaching, so you're under their yoke. You're trusting in what they're telling you. So in the same way, Jesus was calling those of his day to forsake the teaching of the Pharisees that had them working and trying to earn their forgiveness from God, and instead submit to his teaching about God and his righteousness. He contrasts himself to the Pharisees in this verse. Matthew seems particularly interested in contrasting Jesus and the Pharisees, because Jesus offers real hope and real forgiveness, and the Pharisees offer a false sense of righteousness, a false, prideful arrogance. And so we see this. The Pharisees were hard on people. One of Jesus' harshest condemnations upon those who interpreted the law of God for the people was in Luke 11:46. For you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. The Pharisees were content to let everyone perish who couldn't keep their rules. They were also proud. This is best seen in the prayer of the Pharisee found in Luke 18. God, I thank you that I am not like other men. I always see him praying in a British accent. I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give tithes of all I get. These were the types of people who were leading the Jews in their day. I mean, how would you feel if Pastor Andy or Pastor Todd got up and prayed like that on Sunday morning? Or how would you feel if Pastor Andy got up to preach on Sunday morning and every sermon was 10 more commandments that I discovered this week that you need to follow? That would be terrible. But this was the type of leadership that the Jewish people were under. You contrast that to Jesus. Jesus says that he is gentle and lowly in heart. His disposition was not to heap burdensome rules upon his people, but instead he gently and humbly teaches his people. He teaches his followers the commands of God, all while reminding them to come to him and find rest for their souls. He beckons us to forsake trying to earn our own righteousness and to take on the yoke of his righteousness. And he will teach them by his gentle and humble instruction to them. The phrase lowly in heart here means that Jesus was humble in the innermost part. He was humble all the way to the deepest part of his being. He was humble. He's God incarnate, stooping to teach rebellious little children, as it were, to obey his commandments. And as we see once again, that he promises to give those who come under his yoke rest for your souls. It's the same promise, only it is said that those under his yoke will find rest for their souls. In verse 28, Jesus gives the command to come in, and he will give them rest. And in verse 29, those who have submitted themselves will be able to find rest. Again, these verses primarily are an evangelistic call to the people of Jesus' day. But it can also be applied to those who have already put their trust in Jesus for forgiveness. Jesus tells them if we will take his yoke upon him, we will find rest for our souls. Yet, how often do we fail to come back to him when we fail to obey his teachings? We think of ourselves as a failure, and we don't want to come back to God. We don't want to come back to Jesus, and we don't think that Jesus would want to forgive us if we did. So we hide. So we try and clean ourselves up, because we don't think that Jesus wants to forgive us for the millionth time of committing the same sin. But Jesus' words are different. Jesus didn't say, go clean yourself up and then come back to me. Come back to me when you haven't committed that sin for 3 weeks, and I'll give you rest. But instead he says to our rebellious and stubborn hearts, take my yoke upon you and find rest for your souls. We can come to him and keep on coming to him, and every time he will give us rest. Every time we need to come to him, even if it's 10 million times a day, that he will give us rest. And we can find rest for our soul. And he'll never say, I'm sorry, but you've reached your sin limit for the day. No, he says, come to me. Come to me and find freedom from your burden. Take my yoke upon you and experience the rest your soul desires. Learn from me and experience true freedom from guilt and sin. Sometimes we can be as stubborn as the Pharisees in our attempt to please God. Well, I'm going to read my Bible for 2 hours today. I'm going to pray for 3 hours today. And I'm going to share my faith with at least 10 people. So that works for about a day and a half, and then we fail, and we feel burdened by the fact that we didn't keep our own standard. We didn't, I'm such a terrible sinner. I didn't meet my own standard. And so we run from God, and we try to recommit to, I'm going to read 2 hours a day, and I'm going to pray 3 hours a day, and I'm going to witness to 10 people. But we're doing all this while Jesus says, come to me. Come to me and find rest. And come to me and find rest in the fact that I've paid for all your sin. Come to me and you will find that God is pleased with you, not because of your own standard and keeping your own standard of righteousness, but because I earned it for you. And this coming doesn't stop once we initially put our faith in Jesus. It just begins there, and it continues daily until we find true rest for our souls when we die. So, until that time, we can come to Christ and keep on coming to him time and time again. And we will find rest for our souls because he's earned our righteousness. He's earned our pleasure from God through his death and resurrection. And finally, we can come to verse 30, and this verse explains the reason why Jesus' yoke provides for those rest for their souls. Verse 30 says, Jesus says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This verse simply explains to Jesus' followers why they will experience rest and when they submit themselves to his teaching. The reason they will find rest is because his teachings are easy and the burden it brings is light. This doesn't mean that it's easy to keep Jesus' teachings. I mean, Jesus taught that lust is the same as adultery, but it's still very difficult, especially for the gentlemen here. I'm sure they would tell you that it's difficult not to. It's difficult not to inappropriately think of women, but it means that because of the motivation that's changed in the laboring, the work is easier. Think of it like this. Say your teacher has assigned you to read a 400-page book on the Civil War. That seems like a burdensome task. You might scoff and say, yeah, right, I'm not going to read this book, where's the Cliff Notes? But, however, say that your boyfriend or girlfriend or the person you have a crush on comes to you and says, hey, I wrote this 400-page book on the Civil War, and I'd like you to read it. First of all, you'd probably think this person's a nerd. But after that, you'd probably be more willing to read the book because it was written by somebody that you have affection for, someone that you love. It doesn't seem as burdensome to read the book as it did when your teacher assigned because you love the person who asked you to read it. In the same way, when we're striving to gain approval from God and by obeying his commands, it seems really, really hard to do. But when you find that Jesus offers you rest from your attempts to please God by yourself, by receiving his righteousness, it changes your motivation. You now want to please God. You want to obey his commands. You want to obey him because of the great mercy that he's shown toward you. And it feels far less burdensome to obey the commands because you realize that your sin has already been paid for on the cross. Charles Spurgeon put it like this: while I regarded God as a tyrant, I thought of my sin was a trifle, something small. But when I knew him to be my Father, then I mourned that I could ever have kicked against him. When I thought God was hard, I found it easy to sin. But when I found God so kind, so good, so overflowing with compassion, I smote upon my breast to think that I could have ever rebelled against one who loved me so and sought my good. The whole motivation is changed. The motivation is changed when we submit to Christ and we come to him with our burden and find rest for our souls. We can now find pleasure in obeying God's commands because we know that we have his pleasure assured us through Jesus Christ. And I want to close in prayer now, but before I do, I'd like to extend the same invitation that Jesus gave to his people, to the people in his day. If you've never come to Christ, if you find yourself constantly trying to earn your goodness before God, just take Jesus' words. Come to me. Come to Jesus. Come to Jesus and find rest for your soul. Take his yoke upon you. Learn from him by putting your trust in his life, death, and resurrection to earn your salvation, to earn your right standing before God. You can have forgiveness from God because of what Jesus did. So put your trust in him and feel the burden of guilt and the burden of failing to keep his commandments. Have it lifted off your shoulders because you put your trust in him. And to those who have already put their trust in Christ, yet they find themselves running from him whenever they fail, you can do the same thing. You can come to him, you can come to Jesus and let him cleanse you of your sins. Stop running and trying to clean yourself up. He knows exactly what you're going to get into. He knew, it's like Matt Chandler said, he knew you were going to be messy. That's the point of the cross. And so you can come to him and find rest. Find rest every day. Find rest every moment. Every moment that you fail, you can come back to him and find rest. So stop running and come to him. Let him cleanse you. Let him make you right. And just trust that he has made you right already. So as the song that we played a couple weeks ago said, you're not guilty anymore. You are not filthy anymore. I love you. Mercy is yours, coming from the Lord. Come back to him and you can find the rest that your soul craves. Let's pray. God, I thank you for the people here tonight. I thank you for, God, your